Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, the Pennsylvania budget and Health and Human Services we received, more on that, but first, the testing craze in Pennsylvania schools. What's it all mean? Stay with us to find out.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, if you checked into what's going on in Pennsylvania's public schools these days, you're going to find out that it seems like almost every other day the students are taking a standardized test. My guest, who's an expert on this, is Jerry Oleksiak. He's the president of PSEA and a teacher himself, right. So he gets both sides of it, right? You get the policy side of it, and then you also get what you have to do in the classroom. Am I right? Am I exaggerating that there seems to be a standardized testing craze going on?
Craze, absolutely. You are not exaggerating. We have, since No Child Left Behind back in 2001 or early 2002, it has been a real emphasis, too much emphasis on standardized testing in public education. We have an opportunity now with the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, which is ESSA, another acronym, Every Student Succeeds Act. And with the Every Student Succeeds Act, it puts a lot more of the decision-making back on the states instead of the federal government as to what they'll do with standardized testing. So we have an opportunity here to look at the system in Pennsylvania and maybe put a stop on that craze you talked about.
Now, let me get this straight. In order to implement this, to get the actual control back, or much of the control back, as you point out, this has to be approved by the state legislature in the form of a law and then signed by the governor. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Right. What should people care about in that law?
Well, I can tell you that PSEA, the Pennsylvania State Education Association, we have a few priorities related to the legislation that would impact testing. One is that we really want to reduce the time and the resources that's spent on the testing. The other thing is we want to separate the high-stakes nature of the test from standardized testing. It shouldn't be a graduation requirement. It shouldn't be an exit exam like the Keystone exams are designed to be now.
And we're going to talk about that.
Right,
we'll get into the Keystone.
And the other thing is we don't want, there are schools that need help, clearly, and we don't want a standardized test to be the single measure of whether a school or a district does need help. There are a lot of things going on in school districts besides standardized testing.
You know, Jerry, the fact of the matter is when this stuff gets first proposed, okay, you know, maybe it's a good thing. We can, you know, compare across time. But the fact is that the students in schools are at different levels. Right. Teachers have to do a lot more individualized. You're shaking your head because you're...
Well, you know, the easiest way to think of it is, you know, I've told some of our legislative friends, when the kids are standardized, maybe the test could be standardized.
That's a wonderful way to put it.
There's no way to, and when the resources are standardized. We have schools that clearly there's a whole gap. Right. But the good thing is that is starting to change, and there's a real bipartisan effort right now, and this is the positive part of this. Right. There's a bipartisan effort. There has been legislation that's being introduced. Co-sponsors are being sought on both sides of the aisle in both houses, both chambers of the legislature that would address some of these concerns.
Yeah, one of the concerns that we hear about, and again, you're the expert on this, is that, well, what that means is teachers spend an inordinate amount of time, as they say, teaching to the test. Does that really go on?
It has to go on because of the high stakes nature of the test. There are, I think, when I could give you the numbers if I remember them correctly, but it's about 50 hours that's spent in giving not just the PSSA, but the whole range of tests that are given. District test, you know, teacher test, all those things, but primarily the standardized test that the district and the state requires. And altogether, there's over 100 hours that's spent on practicing for the test, giving the test, and that's not even counting remediation that may be involved after the test. So it really has become that crazy you talked about. That's real.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's go to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about what it does to the actual curriculum where you have other things that you're supposed
Absolutely.
to. And again, I'm not opposed to testing.
No,
although,
and nor are we.
Yeah, I didn't do well on standardized tests, so I probably shouldn't
You've
be
done
talking
okay now,
with you.
Terry, I think.
I don't know, but all right. When we get back, what does it do to the curriculum, that the kids in this state, receive from their teachers and from their school districts in terms of complying with these standardized testing requirements at the same time they're supposed to be learning other things? We'll be back in a minute.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association and Partners for Public Education, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Welcome back to the show. Well, I'm chatting with Jerry Oleksiak. He's the president of PSEA and a teacher himself, a special education teacher, and we're chatting about this business of testing. I know it sounds, oh, okay, testing, what does it all mean? But when you spend an inordinate amount of time having to teach for the tests, you can see where that becomes a problem in the schools with more than 1 million kids that end up in the Pennsylvania schools. All right. Once you get into this business of let's be honest, teaching for the test, what does that do to the rest of the curriculum? Now you're in the classroom.
I'm on full-time release now.
I understand,
I was
but
for 32 years.
You spent a lot of time
right.
there.
So,
yeah.
But it narrows the curriculum. Not every subject is tested with the PSSA or the Keystone. So what happens is those areas of the curriculum that are tested become the focus, and we've seen. I taught special education. I know there were the emphasis would be just on those subjects, so kids wouldn't get social studies. Extracurriculars were cut back. Recess time has been cut back. Everything is about what's being tested. So the curriculum has been narrowed to the point that the resources and the time are focused simply on what's being tested.
Yeah.
And not completely, but to a large degree, and that is just unfair to our students. It doesn't
and
it doesn't
teachers
and districts that are being judged on these things. So it really takes. One teacher said it years ago. We're testing the joy of learning right out of our kids.
Oh gosh,
and
I was just going to get to that. I mean, the anxiety. As I said in the last segment, I mean, I was terrible at taking standardized tests. I hated them. Right. I would quiver at the prospects. So it does create a lot more anxiety.
It does. And now schools and teachers and kids are being judged based on that snapshot of that standardized test.
Yeah,
it's unfair to everybody.
Now, there's another aspect of this, and that is, and here you get a little bit of a reversal. Normally, not injecting politics into this because, as you point out, this seems to be more bipartisan, but Democrats want the federal government more involved and Republicans want the state more involved in controlling. You get that big distinction. Right. And so, but it seems to be bipartisan, which is, I think, great. And secondly, the state would be more involved in it as opposed to the federal government. What's that? Talk about that.
That's what the SSA does, the Every Student Succeeds Act. It puts it back on at the state level. And to its credit, some legislators are saying a lot of these decisions need to be made at the local level, with school boards. And the Keystone exams is a perfect example. Right now, the Keystone exams were initially designed, they're the high school tests that are given in 3 different subjects. They were designed to be end-of-course tests. Well, they evolved into exit exams, graduation requirements. That was a state-level decision.
Now, let me get this straight. If you didn't do well, you didn't graduate? Is that what you're telling me?
That's what it became. And to its credit, the legislature and the governor said, wait a minute, let's put a hold on this for a while. So maybe this isn't the best idea. So there's a moratorium on that. And one of the pieces of legislation, of the group of bipartisan pieces we're supporting, is putting that decision back at the local level. Let the school board decide, is this what we want to use as part of our graduation requirements? That's where that decision should be made.
All right, now there's also in these bills that are floating around in the legislature saying that the public schools can't purchase assessments from a private vendor that predict a student's ability. What's that?
Well,
is that like not just goes further than teaching for the test, that you're actually going to...
It's taking a test to predict how you're going to do on the test.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, that's what it is. And fortunately, some legislators, again, bipartisan, both chambers, are saying, let's not put our resources there. Let's put our resources where it's going to help kids learn. And these tests don't help kids learn. They help kids take tests.
Well, as you know, there are always certain groups of people that, for sometimes very valid reasons, want to opt out, don't want to have whatever it is get done, and there's also in consideration a parent opt out, correct?
Right. There currently is a parent opt out.
Currently
there is, but the only reason is for religious reasons. I've never been able to quite figure what religion
would be
is
about
involved in
testing.
that. So what would the legislation would do would be to expand those reasons to philosophical reasons and health reasons. That a parent could also say, I'm opposed to the whole idea of standardized testing, or it creates such anxiety in my kids.
I might be there, by the way.
Well, I understand how, I have 3 daughters. They did pretty well on these tests, and they never complained about it. But I certainly understand. Again, I was a special education teacher, and I saw what it did to the kids in my class.
Oh, I can imagine.
Who I used to tell my administrators, so you're telling me to teach them at their instructional level, but test them at their grade level. And there's a gap there. And
of course.
That creates tremendous anxiety for our special needs kids in particular.
Well, look, I want to thank you for coming in. This is a wonderful update. And also, don't forget, you brought in some students over the last couple of years. That was great to get involved with the students and what they think of what's going on in the public schools and some other things.
And they're surprisingly positive. People don't think that, but we do a great job, and the kids do great.
All right, thanks a lot. All right, coming up, we're going to do a little healthcare update. This is important because we're going to get into the whole issue of opioid and Health and Human Services. Stay with us.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Well, joining me to talk about an important subject, the budget and Health and Human Services, is Richard Edley. He's the president and CEO of the Rehabilitation and Community Providers Association. That's a long title. And you normally go by, what's the acronym?
RCPA.
Yeah, RCPA, I was going to say. All right, let's talk a little bit about this. The budget, we're going to see, first of all, if the legislature gets the budget done and the governor on time. There's some doubt about that this year. Number 2, I don't think there's been enough news and attention paid to Health and Human Services. We have a number of very important crises going on, particularly in opioids. I want to talk about that. And then the other thing is that Governor Wolf has proposed a consolidation, if I got this right, of 4 different entities that provide health and human services. First of all, what do you do? What does your organization do?
Sure. Part of the reason for the large title is we represent a large and diverse group of health and human service providers, over 330 agencies, hospital systems, and so forth. And if I take a moment to list them, it's mental health and drug and alcohol services, intellectual and developmental disabilities, brain injury, med rehab, and also physical disabilities and aging.
It's a mouthful, isn't it?
It's a lot of groups, but the thing that unifies them is they're often considered the safety net providers. providers. These are providers who are dealing with the most disabled, those who are publicly funded, Medicaid funded. So things like the governor's budget become very important. This is how the services are funded for millions of people.
All right, well, without getting into the details, these 4 different departments, then we just had the Secretary of Health, I guess, right? Dave Murphy, Secretary Murphy.
Karen Murphy, yes.
Carol, she's leaving, so so what does that mean? Tell us this. Why should the viewers care about this?
Well, you have 4 departments, health, human services, aging, and drug and alcohol programs.
Right.
The governor came out and said, we could do business better and unify them, be more streamlined, more efficient, look for savings, better serve the consumers and stakeholders, people who we serve. It was hard for me to say, well, I'm opposed to that. I mean, that sounds pretty good. You don't often hear a governor saying, why don't we be more streamlined and efficient? So we came out pretty strongly in favor of this, and I've been out testifying saying, well, if business can be done better, that's great. The other thing, I mentioned all the different groups that we represent, RCPA. Part of the reason we brought together mental health, drug and alcohol, intellectual disabilities.
The coordination of them?
Exactly. Better coordination, sharing of best practices, and so forth. And a lot of the providers aren't in silos. They treat the whole person. So we said, why not? This is a good idea. Now, we understand that, and since I've been testifying, there are people who want to make sure you don't lose drug and alcohol, you don't lose aging.
They're afraid that as you go through the process, one will get more favoritism than the other. You know what I mean?
Exactly. We've heard from children's providers, but to me, all those are reasons that will make sure it's done right, not a reason that don't do it. In fact, when I've testified, I've heard people up there saying how bad the system is now and how fractured it is and in silos and you can't access, but don't change it, don't make it worse. And to me, and
it seems to be some Republicans and some Democrats are not, I'll put it bluntly, not wild about it, and we'll have to see. Well, before we get on to more the substance of a couple of the problems that I want to talk about, what's the prospects that when this is done, will get passed? What's the prospect for it?
When I talk I think it will get passed, and I think that they named recently that the insurance commissioner, Teresa Miller, will now head this, and I think that is a choice that a lot of people can get behind. A lot of good things to be said about the work that she's done. But to me, that's important, but that's only one small piece of the budget. What concerns me more is that because we're a big line item, we serve millions of people and a lot of publicly funded people, it's very easy for legislators to lose sight of the fact of who are we serving here and just say, well, this is a big line item. Maybe we can cut 2%. Maybe we can balance the budget. And this is a chronically underfunded system. And when we talk about everything from school issues and school shootings and adolescent suicide and homelessness and seriously mentally ill, and you go on and on through the list, the opioid epidemic, which
I
you
want to
mentioned.
talk about that in the next segment.
And autism services. This is not an area we say, well, maybe we can cut $100 million out of. And I think it's very easy to be done, and it's happened historically, so you end up having a system that there are pockets that haven't seen increases in a decade.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about opioid and some other problems that the legislature is focusing on, the legislature and the governor are focusing on. We'll get that with Richard Edley after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, advancing quality, improving lives.
Welcome back. We're talking about an important subject, the delivery of health and human services and the budgetary matters and consolidations of entities within the administration, within state government. That's probably not as important to you as it is to the people who get the services. But having said that, here we go, Richard. Tiger Woods, we don't need to get into the details, but it was apparent when he was stopped, no alcohol, that, painkillers probably are involved in this. It's been all over the news. Series of back surgeries. Injury. This leads to a serious opioid problem. Again, I don't want to be premature on the Tiger Woods, but it's all over the news. Why should the average folks care about this opioid thing? I think it's huge, but you tell me if I'm right or wrong.
No, it's been referred to as an epidemic. And recently I saw statistics, and I don't have it in front of me, but what we're seeing is correct. In Pennsylvania, really is ahead of the rest of the country in terms of this epidemic. And I mentioned before how the system's chronically underfunded, and I think that it happens because people can ignore it. You could say, well, that's the intellectual disabilities, that's the disabled, that's brain injury, it doesn't affect me. The reason we're hearing so much about this is it's everywhere. You know, you go to any meeting, any discussion, you meet with people, you hear about the person's daughter, their son, their neighbor, their relative. It's everywhere, and it's in every community. It's in the cities, it's in suburbs, and so forth. And it really
and rural Pennsylvania too. Yeah,
absolutely. I mentioned we represent providers throughout the Commonwealth, and when I've been in very rural areas meeting with legislators, this is the first topic they bring up. And so what we really have to do is address it head on. And the governor has done some things, proposed and actually implemented some what they call centers of excellence to really focus on how do you manage this situation and get people into services. But also, we have to look at the funding aspect of it. I talk to providers who say there's a waiting list of hundreds, if not thousands. So at the same time we're saying we need to do something, does the money follow it? And it's a very
and that
big
leads
issue.
you to get on. And you know, doctors are, you know, now becoming more acutely aware of the problem. That's point number one. Point number two, and this is not unimportant. You know, people who are in the health community want to make sure people aren't in pain.
Right.
I mean, and some of the surgeries, you know, enormous pain with them, and then you get hooked. You can't get off. You go from one drug to another until you get to the H word.
Right.
Heroin.
And it does happen. I've had stitches and immediately gotten a prescription. You wonder, why'd you give me that prescription? And why you give me a refill? And so it's everywhere. One of the other things that we have to look at is advances in treatment. There's something in the field called medically assisted treatment. In the old days, it was methadone. There's lots of others like Suboxone and so forth. And there's still some in the field who are saying, no, you have to get the people off, put them inpatient, and do it the traditional way. And nothing against that. But if there are advances in the field, we need to look at that. We have to hit this with every possible cylinder. And it's no different than if you went to a doctor with a heart problem. If the doctor said, well, this is what we did in the 60s, we'd like to do that with you, you'd say, isn't there anything new? Isn't there some more advance? And there really are. And I think that we have to open up our eyes and look at what are the advances in the field and how do we really address this.
Now, it looks like in the budget, the that, you know, there are, as you know, the governor had a proposal. It looks like that's one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on, at least my following the legislature. And hopefully when the budget gets done, if it gets done, we can argue. I'll argue with other folks about whether it gets done on time or not. But that's likely to be included in it.
Yeah, that seems to have bipartisan support, there's no doubt. Because, as we said, it hits everyone. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. What I'm concerned, it goes back to my earlier statement, that there are line items that people can forget what they mean. So everyone understands the heroin and opioid issue. But for example, right now we have a wait list of 14,000 people for intellectual and developmental disabilities, several thousand on what they call the emergency wait list.
Wow.
So when the governor proposes, well, let's take some money and put it there, a month later people go, well, what's that money for?
Thanks. This was wonderful. It was an important topic. I'm glad we could cover it. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, stay well.